This is FRM Part II, Book 3, Operational Risk and Resiliency, and the chapter on operational resilience and impact tolerance. Let me remind you that after every financial crisis, we seem to have advances in risk management. You've heard me say this before. The three key features of risk management are identify the risk, quantify the risk, and manage the risk. Of course, inside the FRM program, there are different layers of each one of my kind of three steps. But over the last, multiple decades, we've learned about value at risk. We've learned about expected exposure. We've learned about recovery time objectives and a whole host of additional tools that are going to help financial risk managers be better prepared when there are things that occur that, let's just call them, disruption to the operations. That's why part of this title is called For Important Business Services. But let's go ahead and focus here in the introduction on this concept of impact tolerance. And let me compare it to and explain to you how it adds some value to some relatively recent additional tools that the financial services industry has developed to combat all of its risk management challenges. So impact tolerance is different from recovery time objective, which is probably just considered to be maybe some length of time to return to an adequate service after some kind of a disruption. Risk appetite, which we've talked at length about in previous recordings, combined with risk culture, is really just the likelihood of a risk occurring and what our attitude towards that risk is going to be. But what impact tolerance does is it takes it an extra step. And this is probably going to be the focus of any questions from this chapter. Impact tolerance asks the questions that sound something like this. How much harm does the disruption cause to the customers? How much harm does it cause to neighboring financial institutions? And then ultimately, does it cause harm and spread contagion to the financial services industry and financial markets, at least, maybe domestically or perhaps globally? Now, one of the interesting things I found in working through this chapter is that although, of course, in the FRM program, we're focused on financial institutions and financial regulatory authorities, which of course we'll be focused on inside of this slide deck, the authors of this chapter use the term businesses. And so this can apply to almost any business and probably almost any organization out there. And you'll see what I mean when we go through these learning objectives. So there's the first thing. Let's define and describe an impact tolerance. And then we always do some kind of best practices there. So we'll look at some criteria, we'll look at important business services, and then at the end, we'll take a look at an operational resilience policy. And so here's the goal. The goal is to be aware of all of these risks, be aware of the potential disruptions, and then have a plan in place so that when these disruptions occur, we're better able to handle them. That's kind of the nature of this resilience. Quick personal example, I have a gasoline-powered generator sitting in my garage that I've only used once or twice in the last 10 years since I bought it. But what I do every summer is I go and I put some more gas in and I shake it around and I start it up and make sure it works. I plug it in and I come in and put it into the refrigerator or something and make sure it works. There's my own Jim's impact tolerance for if the electricity goes out in our house. That's kind of a silly example and a simple example, but if we have an outage, hey, I'm prepared. And so the question is, if we have a disruption to service, we need to be prepared as a healthy financial institution. All right, the chapter starts with, a little bit of a history lesson. So in the past few years, of course, we're interested in improving our operational resilience. What does that mean? It means for all sorts of outcomes, but notice what the second block point says. Improve operational resilience of firms and also market infrastructure firms. And so those are Those are organizations like stock exchanges and derivative exchanges and clearinghouses as well. And the idea is that, okay, here we are as this, this middle organization, these FMIs, we want to make sure that we do everything. And let me just go ahead and use a business term on the supply chain, so we're serving all of those individuals and organizations that need the exchange to operate. And then as the clearinghouse, we're serving the investment consuming public out there. And so that's pretty much a focus here, to protect consumers. So any question that you get on the exam that sounds something like consumers need to be aided and helped and managed inside of all of these risk management principles, that probably sounds like a correct answer. Now, of course, this chapter is written by and for, and then for the rest of us, by a handful of institutions over in the UK, headed by the Bank of England, and then the Prudential Regulation Authority, that's all part of the Bank of England, and then the Financial Conduct Authority. So just think of these organizations as these bodies, these government bodies, maybe they're quasi-government bodies, maybe they're self-regulatory agencies. Now, these three are not like that, but they can be supervisory authorities that have the integrity and the honesty and the efficiency of capital markets, not just, of course, in the UK, but globally as well. And so this chapter is written as kind of a summation of what these organizations have done over the last handful of years, and they make some proposals to try to help financial institutions primarily improve their operational resilience. One interesting side note is that this concept of impact tolerance is very likely to be attributed to, I didn't mean to go back there. Very likely to be attributed to the reaction to COVID throughout the world. But in fact, these organizations and institutions were working on impact tolerance before COVID hit in 2020. All right, so what is impact tolerance? Well, at its basic level, it is the idea of how much comfort do I have in worrying about whether a lightning storm is going to knock out the electricity in my house. Do I stay up day and night looking out at the clouds and getting my binoculars out and saying, oh, there's a cloud over there. Does that have a lightning bolt in it? Or do I just not care at all? Do I say something like, you know what, when the electricity goes off, I'll deal with it then. So these are two extreme examples, and probably neither one of them is healthy for me, right? As a 60-year-old man, I don't need all that stress every day. Or if I go to the other extreme, I don't need that mountainous stress when the electricity goes out. So look on the horizontal axis, we have time. So this is called duration, not the duration for fixed income securities, but time as measured, duration as measured by, minutes. If I'm that clearinghouse corporation on the floor of an exchange, I don't really want to be disrupted for days. If I'm disrupted for days, I'm probably out of business. So maybe an hour, but maybe minutes, whatever that duration is. And then on the vertical axis, we have this impact. And so notice what we have down close to the origin is a minor inconvenience, then a major inconvenience, then harm. And then notice, this is why I like this illustration so much. Harm, this is not good, but then intolerable harm, that's probably going to be somewhere beyond which we don't want to go for our clients and our customers and our relationships that we have with third parties. And so what we need to do is we need to set that impact tolerance. This is crucial, that crucial point for operational resilience. Now let's go ahead and move on to this IBS, this important business service. A couple of definitions by these two regulatory authorities. a service provided by a firm to another person that, if disrupted, could pose all sorts of risks. And notice what some of those risks are. Let me skip over to two first. The firm's safety and soundness, appropriate degree of protection for those who may become or are the firm's policyholders. This is for those financial institutions like insurance companies that deal primarily in contracts. But then skip back up to number one. Inside of the financial system, we have these banks that are, kind of generally known as too big to fail. So we know who those organizations and institutions are. They're just these huge firms, right? But then there are these other firms that they might not be too big to fail. Maybe I could call them nearly too big to fail, but we call them other kinds of firms that systematically or systemically pose some kind of a risk to maybe the domestic environment and maybe perhaps globally, but not on a total global network like those too big to fail firms. And then the FCA has a similar definition: service provided by a firm, behalf of the firm, or to one more others in the firm. So think about both sides of the supply chain that cause intolerable levels of harm, soundness, stability, and resilience. So there's some similarities between those two. I think if you combine those into one kind of a general definition, you'll be able to answer a question on the IBS. How about a couple of quick examples here about important business services? So let's suppose we're a retail bank and we provide online and telephone banking services. Oh boy, so what happens here? What's our impact? What's our disruption? What are the important business services that are exposed to those kinds of disruptions? So let's suppose this retail bank finds that a substantial proportion of its customers use online banking as their primary channel. Of course, most of us use online banking. Quite frankly, I can't remember the last time that I actually walked into my bank. I'm sure I have for some reason in the last year, but clearly we're doing online banking services. Now, of course, if my phone or my computer or the internet goes down, I could get in my car and I could drive to the financial institution. I could do that. But there might be substantial harm done to me because I couldn't execute a trade to buy some shares of stock that I wanted to. And by the time I got down to the bank, the stock price had let's say it's doubled. That sounds like consumer harm. So online banking would be an important business service. How about an insurance company, motor insurance, health insurance, and then my favorite, pet insurance. We do not have pet insurance for our dog, although maybe we ought to. But if we go ahead and take a look at our income statement, and it shows that our revenues come from health insurance, then what we need to make sure is to be able to identify that as the important business services, because a disruption could cause untold or intolerable harm. So health insurance then would be the important business service. So let me just swing back here: online banking, and then health insurance. And so it's our responsibility then as good financial risk managers to establish, here, let me go back here real quick, to establish this maximum tolerable level of disruption to that important business service. All right, how about that learning objective that regards best practices? So what we want to do is we want to apply separate impact tolerances that reflect the objectives of the two supervisory authorities. All right, so this is important. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set those PRA tolerance levels for the important business. Well, we're going to do that at the same level as the FCA. We're going to define and identify these specific metrics. And a lot of these metrics in terms of disruption are going to be based on duration, like a time metric. But they don't have to be time metrics. It could be volume. It could be number of trades. It could be size of the trade. Let me give you just a quick example. Going back to, let's suppose we're a clearinghouse corporation, and for some reason I show up on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange with a big old laundry basket full of gold, and I get in line to buy a particular share of stock with a designated market maker, and everybody can see my see-through laundry basket, and I'm struggling, I'm holding it here, and everybody sees this big pile of gold. And since I'm in the buy line, everybody knows I'm going to buy these shares of stock. So people in the sell line, they're saying, wait a minute, if Jim has all this gold, there's no way I'm selling. He knows something that I don't know. So everyone gets in the buy line, and the designated market maker, he or she, this is the best day of their life. So they're raising the price and trying to figure out bid and ask, trying to maintain their inventory. Meanwhile, the clearinghouse is in the background looking at all this, and they're saying, okay, I'm going to clear these for the financial markets, right? But then when Jim gets up there, how much does a bag of gold, a laundry basket of gold, how many shares of stock can that buy? Who knows? Maybe 1 billion. And so that clearinghouse is saying, oh my gosh, I'm going to be disrupted because I'm going to be clearing every one of these trades. I can't clear 1 billion shares in 1 second, can I? That means I'm going to harm all of those other people out there who rely on me to clear all of these trades. So remember that in this best practice, we're probably going to use some kind of a time-based metric. How long is it going to take the clearinghouse to clear all those trades so he or she can pick up and clear all of the other trades? I mean, maybe, here, let me go back here real quick. I mean, maybe my example gets us down here to only a level of inconvenience. The clearinghouse says to all these other people, hey, just hold on 1 second, and then it's all done fairly quickly. But it's probably going to be somewhere up in the harm, and maybe even in the intolerable harm. So as that time goes out, as that duration, seconds and minutes and hours, boy, then we're getting way past that threshold. Let's see, I think I finished that one there. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at some criteria. And this is important. Notice we have this in bolded up there. Clearly identifiable and standalone business service. And so we talked about those earlier. ATM services could make up an IBS. But packaged accounts that provide a bundle of services cannot. And go ahead and skip down to the bottom there. This is not going to be internal functions. Things like human resources or payroll, or some services that deal with, maybe both sides of the supply chain. And then we need to make sure that these are not transversal processes. Remember, transversal, you put 2 lines together and then you put another line on top of those 2 lines, intersecting lines. So a transversal process is part that affects, this line and this line, or this service. So those don't qualify as important business services. What are the examples that we give there? Surveillance, payment processing, etc. All right, now we get into some really, really cool stuff here. How are we going to improve our operational resilience? So we have this definition of impacts, and we know we can go back to that old graph and we can say, is it an inconvenience or is it harmful? Is it harmful to our customers? Is it harmful to our clients? Is it harmful to the financial system? All right, how can we be better prepared? And so we're going to do this in a handful of ways. How about if we start with mapping? And let me give you the example just of my personal life as a college professor. What are my responsibilities? I teach a bunch of classes every semester, so I'm responsible for, let's say, 100 students a semester. I also do advising. I probably advise 50 or 70 students a semester. I have obligations to my department, to my school, and to the entire college, as well as to the community. And so we would map this out. So we would say, okay, Jim, let's go ahead, Jim, classroom. So there's 100 students there. And we would say, Jim, service to the department. All right. And so we're mapping all of these out. And sometimes they're going to cross, right? And there's going to be cross functions. And the important thing here is, look at that second block point. identifying and documenting the necessary people and processes and technology because here, wait a minute, where am I? Because let me say this, Jim. Oh, there we go. You guys know I love my financial calculator. And so there's my calculator. If some reason that my calculator goes dead during the middle of a lecture on how to calculate the price of an interest rate swap, oh my gosh, I'm failing. That's a disruption. Now, of course, my students, they just get out their phones and start playing Fortnite on their phones, but that's a disruption. And so technology, make sure you remember that thing for each important business service. So we've identified those IBSs, and now we're mapping. And so just think a map, just go like this. It could be a web, could be straight lines, could be curvy lines, depending on what that relationship is. So look at that first block point, holistic view of the systems and processes. That makes sense. All right, so why do we do this? What are the benefits? Identify vulnerabilities. Like, for example, if Jim's financial calculator runs out of batteries, how are we vulnerable? Well, I guess I should carry around 3 of those little chunky batteries that the HP12C uses. I could carry them around in my pocket all the time, but I probably would lose those. But the important thing then is we identify those vulnerabilities, and then we take action to remedy those, and then we throw some kind of a test out there. And of course, going back to my clearinghouse example, what we do is we map this out. Okay, who are all of my customers and clients and supply? Who relies on me to provide that service? And where am I vulnerable? I mean, clearly, if Jim shows up with a bag of gold, that's going to cause some kind of an overload into the system. And then we have to ask ourselves the question, and this is a great question. Hey, what do I do if Jim shows up? It's one thing to think about it, but I need these steps, step 1, step 2, step 3. This is why you hear world-class, successful, football and basketball and hockey coaches. They say things like, every day we practice, let's decide what's the worst thing that could happen at the end of a game. There's 42 seconds left. We have the ball. We're down by 2 touchdowns. Let's figure it out. And so they practice this. What is that second block point? To remedy the vulnerabilities. There we go. And then I'm guessing that you would remember this from previous recordings. I'm a big fan of sensitivity analysis and scenario testing. I have my students do this in Excel all the time, primarily in an investments class, but it can be done in corporate finance class as well. And so what are we going to do? We're going to say something like, okay, what happens when Jim brings the gold? What happens when Jim just brings a $100 bill? So we need to, in this scenario testing, identify whether this is going to be a high probability, low impact event, which would be, me buying 10 shares of stock. You can easily clear that, right? But let's go ahead and say, what's a low probability, high impact event? And then what is that plausible disruption? That's important. Look at the second one there. So during this scenario testing, we're going to change these input variables and we're going to test them with different adverse circumstances, different levels of severity, and different levels of duration. Suppose I come with my bag of gold, and as soon as those trades occur, what if somebody else comes with a bag of silver and wants to sell? Then you have both sides, supply and demand. You have no idea what's going on. And so that's really what scenario testing prepares us for, is the idea that, boy, there's that unknown out there. Let's try to prepare for it. Look at the third block point. We can consider past incidences like stock market crashes, like real estate bubbles, like COVID, or we can look at some things like, hey, let's take a weather example. Suppose there's a hurricane or a tornado that just misses our building or just misses our area. And of course, what we're going to do as good humanitarians is when that misses, we're going to take a time out and go help those people over there. But we need to then ask ourselves the question, all right, what happens? What happens if it hits us directly? near misses. So we near missed, but let's prepare for a direct hit next time. Of course, we can't prevent these things from happening. Remember, that was our difference between that recovery time objective and the impact. What we can do, though, is determine the what must be done to re-deliver, is that a word? To deliver again, to maintain our operations after that disruption. Boy, we've talked about this regularly, and I'm not sure that I need to go into this one in too much detail. We spent a lot of time talking about the risk culture. Remember, I was saying to you in that risk culture recording that it's the responsibility of the board and the senior leadership team to walk around the office and say, hey, let's go ahead. Let's talk about the Super Bowl. Yeah, of course. Let's talk about our new television show. Let's talk about Wordle. Yeah, let's talk about, but when we're done doing all this stuff that bonds us and brings us together socially and culturally, well, then let's go ahead and start talking about risk. What do we think about risk? What do we want to do about it? So the board and the senior executive leadership team are responsible. And that doesn't mean let's just go ahead and talk about it, but we need clear lines. All right, so they say something like, okay, Johnny, you're in charge of this. Jenny, you're in charge of this. And then Johnny and Jenny, their role is to go out and identify all these things that we've talked about inside of this recording. Now, remember back in that initial slide, I was telling you about the difference between impact tolerance and risk appetite and recovery time objective. Well, the chapter goes into a special couple of paragraphs on this difference here. So let me go ahead and read this to you. Impact tolerance assumes that a particular risk has crystallized. Risk appetite, on the other hand, tries to estimate some type of a probability of an event, and then maybe the consequences of the event. And so let me go ahead and emphasize again that this impact tolerance takes risk appetite to an extra step. And that's what we write down in that second block point. Impact tolerance, service-led exercise that focuses on preventing harm to customers. This is what I've talked about throughout this slide deck. And risk to the market. So there's that word integrity. I love that word integrity. So let's go ahead and look at this last illustration. And notice that we've divided this into three colors, green. So here's the likelihood going along the horizontal axis, and then the impact on the vertical axis. So in the green area down in the bottom left, this is the area where we're probably okay. Just our regular old operating procedures, our regular old awareness of risk management principles, probably gets us through that green area. And notice the blocked lines there, those look like steps down there. That's our risk appetite. So then all the way up at the top, that dotted line, that's our impact tolerance. And so in the yellow region, what we're doing is we're saying something like, okay, we need to start worrying about this disruption, right? We're not worried about the likelihood here. We're worried about the disruption. And then once we hit the red up there, there's our dangerous zone. There is the impact tolerance. So once we hit that level, then we need to go back and find out and identify all of the outputs that came from the mapping and the sensitivity and the scenario analysis. All right, so are you ready for this? Continuity planning. Banks and all financial institutions and all firms should have an adequate contingency and business continuity plans to ensure that they can operate in the event of a severe interruption. And make no mistake, firms, organizations, but especially financial institutions learned a great deal about this during COVID. Now, there's an emphasis inside of this chapter about outsourcing to third parties. And so the idea here is to make certain that if we do some stuff over there with a third party, like payroll or maybe processing transactions in and trades in the derivatives market. If we do all that over there with a third party, well, then we need to make certain that that third party is aware of all of our resilience policies, all of our mapping, all of our sensitivity analysis, so that if there's a disruption of that third party, then we can perform our duties. We can integrate all of those outputs so that we have a seamless transition from pre-event to a post-event. And that takes us through our learning objectives. Only 4 of them, but clearly that definition of impact tolerance, and then the mapping and the sensitivity analysis, and then the continuity plans, I think those might be among the most important. So thank you for watching and good luck studying.